As an economist, I have a preference, a bias, I should say, for the economics panel, but I think this one is going to be even more interesting. We're doing something radically different here. We're actually getting people who run the networks to talk about the networks rather than the people who normally talk about the networks in public policy space. We have a very, very good panel of experts today. We have Ed Amoroso from AT&T, Jason Livingood from Comcast, and Mark Wegleitner from Verizon. All of these guys are actively involved in running the broadband networks for their companies, designing them, running them, and dealing with security issues and so forth. We also have with us Rob Curtis from the FCC. All their bios, by the way, are in the speaker bio handout. If you don't have it, there's out on the table. Rob is he's an old school telecom guy now. He is very actively involved in the broadband team at the FCC, doing what he does best, which is deal with very smart people to compensate for what he lacks. No, I'm just kidding. Rob and I are old friends, and he's my old boss, and with a PhD in philosophy from Oxford and a law degree from Duke, it's difficult to say Rob doesn't have any sense, although I do it frequently. But that's just because I love him. So we will start here. We'll go in order at the table. We'll begin with Mark. We'll go and we'll try to have, we got 4 panelists, so we'll try to do about 10 to 12 minutes apiece and leave room for questions, which I think some people may have. I know I've got a few I would like to have answers to. So we'll begin with Mark and continue from there.
All right, thank you, George. Good morning, everybody. A pleasure to be here. I'm going to spend, as George suggested, just a few minutes talking a little bit about what goes on in the Verizon network, broadband network in particular, both wireline, wireless, and give you a feel for the kinds of issues we deal with and, you know, what we're thinking about and how it might apply to our current exploration here of a regulatory environment around net neutrality. Let me start with a few statistics. We run a fairly good-sized network, as you would expect. It is a global network. We have thousands of routers. We have tens of thousands of facilities, either, you know, measured as small buildings, large buildings, whatever, hundreds of thousands of network elements, actually. And it covers a multitude of telecommunications or all communications technology, wireline, wireless, optical, IP layer technologies, as well as applications layer technologies. We have a lot of data centers that you know, serve customers in the sense of providing applications and services. And as you can see here, I won't read all these numbers, 1.7 billion text messages exchanged every day. I mean, as of a year ago, we were doing 1 billion a day. Before that, we used to talk about 1 billion a quarter. This continues to grow at just an astronomical rate. We do a lot in motion video. We do a lot in video streaming, obviously. We do a lot in security. I think Ed will talk a lot more about that in a minute. We have 1 billion phone calls here at the end of the list, obviously, because, you know, while that may not be the focus of this meeting, it's still an important communications business. So I'm going to answer the question right away. The question was, does congestion matter? And absolutely it matters, because, you know, when things like this don't work, our customers actually call us and want to talk about that. Okay, that's a pretty normal reaction. They pay for the service, they expect it to work, and they really don't totally understand the implications of running the network that underlies all of this stuff, because if they can send an MMS message, I think you know what MMS is, multimedia messaging system. If they can send an MMS message when they're walking down the street, they just don't understand why they can't send it at kickoff of the Michigan-Ohio State game when 1/3 of the stadium is doing that at the same time. So it does matter. It does make congestion is something we take into account every day when we are designing and running these networks. And matching, of course, this complexity of the network is the investment that preceded it. Right now, we're investing about $17 billion, maybe $17.5 billion a year in network infrastructure, both wireline and wireless, and we think we're building a smarter network every day. Over the last 5 years, that comes up to about $80 billion. A couple of the high-profile things that you're probably all familiar with that we're investing in currently and very relevant to our discussion today about broadband access and internet services are these two. One, the first is FiOS, which is our fiber to the premises program, and we have it now deployed in 17 states. We'll have 17 million homes passed by the end of 2010, which is basically on track with a commitment we made some years ago now. And we're obviously available in several major metropolitan areas as well. This is a $23 billion investment, and I don't think anyone has undertaken, at least in North America, no one has undertaken a fiber to the home program at this scale and at this investment level, and we're doing it because we see broadband obviously as the future of our business. On the right-hand side, we have the wireless network. We have a 3G network today that's available to about 284 million people. We've invested $30 billion of that $80 billion in our wireless network over the last 5 years, and we're moving forward with 4G technology, which was just mentioned by the Commissioner in the last presentation. As are many of the service providers, I might add, we're being particularly aggressive here. We think it's, again, speed matters, and we do think that an improved broadband service, both in terms of speed and capability, is a big part of the picture. We will be in front of 100 million people by the end of 2010, according to our current plan, and we are on that plan. Now, getting to the meat of the matter here, which is congestion, I'll just go right to it and just say that network management is indeed a necessary part of running any network. You know, there are lots of things that happen in the network. Facilities fail, you get fashion shows on the internet, you get this Michigan and Ohio State phenomenon, you get an inauguration that's watched worldwide, you get the future will bring the internet to applications that we associate with telephone call-in or SMS messaging today, like American Idol. That'll all be on the internet, and there'll be focused overloads. There's also bad things that happen out there. I mean, there are some acts of God that really can't be dealt with very easily, but through standard network management techniques, like the Southeast Asian earthquakes of the past few years had a substantial disruption, created a substantial disruption for the internet, and we as network providers had to react to that. And then finally, just to be fair about this, I mean, sometimes this stuff breaks. Things just don't work. This is stuff designed and built by humans, and there are some mean time between failure occurrences that just have to be accounted for in the running of a network. Now, it's been suggested that if you just put enough capacity out there, you won't have a problem. You just throw capacity at this, which really doesn't hold up very well in our world, because, as we say at the bottom here, network congestion and points of failure are truly unpredictable in time, place, and severity. And if we really wanted to solve this problem by just over-engineering, as we call it, or providing additional capacity, then more capacity than you need, building to the peak, however you want to explain it. In the old days, we called this EVE, or extreme value engineering. The fact is that would be an unaffordable network. You would be basically building 2, 3, 4 networks in order to handle the potential for catastrophic failure or focused overload, whatever you want to attribute it to. Now, we know that that's the situation today, and that's the world we live in, but I mean, it's changing as we go forward, right? Because there are a number of applications that are coming forward that are going to have, an incredible impact on the internet and on, basic networking. Just look at video. I mean, the role of video and the kind of usage that our broadband devices are taking right now as a result of video streaming or even video downloads is astronomically growing the amount of bandwidth that's required here. There are going to be new applications. There are going to be old players in new places. There are going to be new players, coming in to do old things as well as new things. And in general, what we're going to have here is a continued growth in not only the backbone, but obviously the access technologies in order to meet the customer requirements. So we're going to have a need for additional bandwidth in the backbone and in access in the very near future. And part of the solution to addressing that, we think, is to build even smarter networks. Now, I know there's a lot of discussion in the NPRM about what it means to have managed or specialized services. There are many paragraphs of that document devoted to this subject. And some of those relate to things like private services, maybe FiOS TV in our case would be one. But some of those discussion items also deal with the idea of being able to provide network capabilities that will enable applications to perform better in the network. And if you look at the left-hand side of this diagram here, what we're trying to illustrate is you have a lot of applications like, a calendar or a telemedicine or navigation or a VoIP or even a movie from a streaming or download perspective. And that's all going into a network which, if it is all best effort, those applications are going to be bumping into each other. They'll be bumping into each other more often when there's congestion in the network than when there's not, but they will nonetheless all be in there kind of mixed in and ultimately delivered to the end users, hopefully. On the right-hand side, from a network perspective, and when I talk about being able to provide smarter networks, you see that the network itself can provide an orderly transit for all of those applications to the end users. Now, we get into a lot of discussions about what would be good management and what would be bad management, but this is an extension, a natural extension of a network's function is to be able to take a multitude of applications with a huge variety, more every day, and make sure that they get safely into the hands of the customers. And, as a network guy, as a guy who's been building and designing and running networks like this for some time, this is the kind of thing that we're very interested in doing because we think it makes sense and because it's our business. And we actually believe that the volume and choice of the applications will grow if network providers are allowed to innovate in their networks along with everyone else who's innovating around the edge. And if this doesn't work for somebody, we aren't suggesting that everybody would have to go through this process. We have been talking about a principle in the Verizon scene about door 1 and door 2. If you consider door 1 the best effort network on the left, that's still okay, it's available. If you want door 2, you want better service, you want assured delivery, you want quality of service, you've got a very critical application like telemedicine, something like that, then you can take that as a choice, you the applications provider or you the end user. Now, one of the things we've been doing is really supporting the principle of openness in the Verizon network, and the best example of that, I think the most concrete example and real example is the Verizon developer community or the wireless open development ecosystem. And what we're basically doing is disconnecting the handsets from the network, allowing any device that passes, just a small amount of certification to be able to interconnect with the Verizon network. And then we're providing the radio hardware, the applications, and most importantly, the I/O interface or the API so that applications can be built to connect to our network. In other words, not just on the device side, but within the device and also from the application side can be provided by other parties and still run on the Verizon network. So our commitment remains very firm in this area. Obviously, it's a big part of our 4G rollout that we're proceeding with that I explained early on, and we would expect that this will be hugely important in continuing to promote the number and variety and choice of applications for our end users. Now, in all of that debate that we're having about what's going on here with net neutrality and network management and congestion and managed and specialized services and everything else, it could look like, the service providers are at odds with virtually anyone who's a proponent of, what has been termed true network neutrality. But indeed, there's a lot of common ground here. We obviously, as Verizon, believe in an open internet. We have always supported the 4 principles to the best of my knowledge, and I believe this is true. We actually helped in crafting them. We also think users should have the final say about their internet experience. There's no issue there. But the future growth of the web requires advanced and open networks and more sophistication, more innovation inside the network as well as around the network. And there has to be incentives for continued investment. And that's indeed where we feel we are today with things like FiOS and 4G and wireless going out and additional capabilities in the network. But we have to make sure that that is sustained moving forward. So the thing that we're probably most concerned about, not most concerned about, one of the things we're concerned about is that we don't want to clog up the system with what would be termed by some unnecessary rules and regulations. There are things that happen in the network that, require clarity and where delay does matter. Many of these things happen at 2 o'clock in the morning. I don't know why that is, but bad things happen all around the clock. But at 2 o'clock in the morning, I don't know if I can afford to call a lawyer to find out whether the action I'm about to take in the network is going to be okay, because, there's a crisis at hand and it has to be dealt with immediately. So one of the things from the network operations side we want to ensure is that we understand what the rules are. And that isn't always the case. And we think that, frankly, in this particular proceeding, there's fertile ground here for additional lack of clarity, if nothing else. So let me just leave you with these thoughts. I tried to deliver 3 messages here today. One is we're committed to building good and useful networks, and our investment history and current investment track shows that. Our belief is that we have to be able to manage them. I'm trying to give you some examples of why that is. Traffic demands on the network are going to increase. They're going to make this kind of network management and smart network capability all the more important going forward. We support innovation, and our open network policies demonstrate this. And then finally, our strong feeling is that the network has to be part of that innovation equation. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. We now have Jason Livingood, Executive Director of Internet Systems Engineering at Comcast. Do my slides in here? Thank you very much. My name is Jason Livingood, and at Comcast, I am essentially the engineering lead for our high-speed internet service. And I thought I'd speak to you a little bit today, bring an operator's view, a really day-to-day operational view of the network, and talk about a few things. The first is ISP motivations for congestion management or network management. Tell you a little bit about our congestion management system, and then sort of dovetail that into what the internet community at large is doing about congestion, and that this is sort of becoming more recognized as a wider problem. It's not just something that operators are facing on their own. I think just to kick off the first part, it was interesting. I started my current job in February of 2008. That was right around the time that the BitTorrent issue that we've all talked about was sort of getting hot and heavy, and I think the Harvard unbank hearing was right around that time. And I was heads down on a project at the time and just transitioning in, and was sort of marveling at what exactly is going on, and then had the interesting conversation with our CTO and the head of my unit. Essentially said, this is a pretty big problem and you need to go fix it. And so I've got a lot of sort of front row experience with that transition, which was very interesting. The really fascinating part about congestion management is that you have this wide array of applications and use types on the internet that occurs because of the fact that you've got so much innovation at the endpoints and in applications. But as an ISP, you have to balance all of those things and ensure that those application experiences work well for all of the users. And when that doesn't work well, what tends to happen is, as the previous speaker mentioned, they pick up the phone and they call you. That obviously creates customer dissatisfaction. That costs us money when they phone us in. And, it's not something that we like. As we all know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The ironic part about the whole BitTorrent incident is that our sandvine system was really implemented because we had gotten a lot of complaints from over-the-top voice-over IP providers, primarily Vonage, about the fact that we had congestion that was periodically occurring in the network and it was degrading the experience of their application. We were very, very unhappy. So we implemented this system, turned it on. Interestingly, all of those complaints went away. We didn't get those calls anymore. People weren't concerned about that anymore. That being said, it's probably a technically inelegant solution, to put it in a good way, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. But we have these mixes of customers. Some are very interested in real-time applications like gaming, like VoIP, like video conferencing. Others are interested in bulk file transfers, downloads of movies and music, and so on. And you have to balance all of those things together. We also have to balance, multiple external concerns, both the internet community, regulators,
and other things, and obviously have to run a sustainable business model to make sure that we can profitably operate a network and continue to invest in it. And the other thing that came out, people often said, just when you see congestion, you just have to add capacity. That's not as easy as flipping a switch. That takes a lot of time to plan, to order equipment, to, if you have to do construction, and that capacity in many cases can be consumed very, very quickly. In fact, some applications are designed to use as much of the content, or the speed that's available, so those capacity additions can go away very quickly. In terms of our congestion management system, as we transitioned away from the old Sandvine system that we were using, it was very focused on one application, on peer-to-peer applications. We wanted to do a few things. First, we wanted to be protocol and application agnostic, so it didn't target any of those applications. And we wanted it to be something that wasn't sort of always running at all times of day. It would only run at the targeted times when congestion was likely to occur, and only have an impact when it actually did in those very, very narrow time windows. And I think it's important to understand those narrow time windows you're talking about are microseconds, seconds, minutes. These are not extended multi-hour periods. If that's the situation, there's a different network problem, which is not the type of sporadic congestion that occurs in any network. In terms of the way that our network congestion management system works today, we essentially had before a single best effort quality in terms of the packets, how they were treated. We created two sets of those. We created a priority best effort that all traffic would run at before when congestion didn't occur, and at times when congestion was occurring, for the users that volumetrically were contributing the most to causing that congestion, their packets would be marked with a somewhat lower level of quality of service. And what that meant is that we would see these things happening in advance. We would get those things to occur and sort of prepare for that congestion time. And the majority of the time, those packets would be marked as best effort and priority best effort. No one would notice. And those few seconds of time when congestion actually occurred, the person that's contributing the most would sort of be impacted by that. And interestingly, we've gotten essentially no complaints of applications breaking because of it, no customer dissatisfaction. I think it's a fair system, and we've been pretty happy with it. And there's been a lot of interest from other providers. And recently had a conversation last week with some European equipment vendors about how other networks and other markets could adopt a similar type of a system. And I think it's also important to point out that very, very, very few customers were impacted by this. It is well below 1%. 1% was our design criteria, and it's well below that number. So it's got a very light touch, and it only does this sporadically. I'm not going to go through this eye chart. This is probably a little too engineering focused, but just sort of a visual description of how the quality of service system works. Won't go into that. So in summary, our motivations, in our system in general, it's been an effective system for us since we implemented it. We finished implementing it in 2008. It is completely application neutral. It supports open internet standards. We've published an internet draft that describes the system at the IETF, and that's continuing to iterate, and we'll move towards an RFC at some point. We collaborate with the IETF, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But as we've gone through this process, it was interesting because a lot of people felt this was just a congestion problem on the Comcast network. That wasn't the case. What was happening was that you were starting to see new application types come out, new applications develop that were designed to take advantage of all of the bandwidth available, and you started to see this happening on other networks. And that leads me to sort of the next part, which is what the technical community has been doing. So, prior to 2008, you saw ISPs trying to solve the congestion problem creatively on their own, not always with good results. And after that, we started to push the community, and others did as well, to say, this is a problem that doesn't just affect the Comcast network, it affects other networks, any IP network really. And sort of going through the history, there was a May 2008 conference that the IETF held at MIT to talk about this issue, and out of that has flowed a tremendous amount of work in the internet community. And this lists down here all the different working groups and other efforts that are going on since that time, all going back to that IETF workshop. One is about latency-friendly file transfer, and this is about for people that are using those bulk applications, could they use sort of a scavenger service so that they step out of the way of real-time applications if they need to use available capacity. Other things related to peer-to-peer caching and localization of traffic, end-to-end congestion signaling. So this is a problem. We can solve this congestion management issue in our individual access network or in our backbone. But what happens when we've got somebody that's, say, trying to play World of Warcraft or trying to access a website or use content, and you're going across 5 networks, and there's congestion at 1 or 2 points in between those networks? How do you signal back to the end application, to the user, to the networks that that's occurring? There's not currently a tool set that does that, so there's development needed for those sorts of things. Also in home gateways, broadband home gateways, there's a lot of immaturity in terms of support for congestion notification and other tools. And in fact, one of the things that we observe with a lot of our home users is that they can cause congestion even within their own home network. So they'll call us sometimes and complain, hey, I'm downloading a bunch of stuff from peer-to-peer torrents, and I'm trying to make a phone call and play Xbox Live, and Xbox Live keeps dying, and I keep walking around the corner, and some guy comes and shoots me, and I'm dead, and I don't like it. And you dig into it, and you find out that they're congesting their own home network, and that there are things that they can do in their home gateways to solve those things. And since then, the ITF has done a number of things. They held a technical plenary about network neutrality to try to introduce the engineers to the fact that network neutrality is going on. They should understand that these discussions are going on, get involved in them. The Internet Society, ISOC, just had a discussion at the last ITF, and 2 interesting studies at the end. And one of the things that was a complaint when we were going through the BitTorrent affair was that people said, we're not sharing any data about how our networks work. ISPs and operators in general don't, so there's no way to prove the growth numbers that are cited and so on. And so there's been a big effort there to change that. There's an MIT Internet Traffic Analysis study that's going on that a number of ISPs are participating in, and a much bigger effort that there was just a report on. This is part of an Arbor effort, over 110 ISPs. You can Google for those things and find them. They're very interesting. And I think, as I move to closure here, the current congestion control mechanisms that are used in the Internet today were designed in the late 80s, implemented starting in the 90s. They were designed at a time when you had backbone speeds for the entire Internet backbone that were equivalent to what you see in your home today. So they were very, very different problems, and it's very important for the community to focus on this. It's not about any one individual network or network technology. This is a pervasive, community-wide problem that needs to be worked on. And in general, I think there's often the question about, is this something you can just build out of? And I think the answer is, you can build out of some types of congestion, the sort of persistent congestion that is there, but the sporadic congestion that is the bigger problem that people often point out is just almost impossible to predict. And you need systems and networks that can react to those things, and when it does occur, can differentiate between things that are real-time based, that are like telemedicine and other things that have to get through, and things that are, looking at the Facebook updates and Tiger Woods and this kind of stuff. There's a bunch of things that we're doing here, best managed, I think, via protocol-agnostic methods. We've certainly learned that the hard way. Lots of other things going on. And I think it's important to point out, there was an interesting quote by one of the folks that's very involved in TCP protocol design that said, essentially, if some place along the path isn't congested, then protocol designers aren't doing their job right, because what should be happening is that the applications try to use the maximum amount of bandwidth. When they find that limit, they step back. And so in the process of doing that, it's possible that they might cause some congestion. So those things are, I think, interesting, and I think we've got some interesting Q&A later on. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. That was very interesting. We appreciate your willingness to talk about the BitTorrent case. Surprising. Okay, but very interesting. All right, we'll have Ed Amarsa for AT&T.
Hi, folks. Thanks for the intro. 2 very good talks. Just by way of background, I've been on the Internet for about 40 years. My dad had a PhD in computer science in the early 60s, I think one of the first or second. PhDs ever given. So I kind of grew up in and around the internet and have watched some pretty massive changes. Started at Bell Laboratories and have been doing computer security for 25 years. And I've been in charge of computer and network security at AT&T for the past 10, including all the different major mergers that we've been through. So I want to give you a little perspective on some of the problems we've been working. Now, exactly 1 decade ago, we had a team here in Washington preparing the final touches on our Y2K Information Coordination Center that we were doing for the White House. Very interesting project. Like, we turned a room about twice the size of this ballroom into a big fusion center for the White House. And right around this time, 10 years ago, a group from the Department of Defense called us in and showed us the first real workable reflective attack. And kind of scared me. That's when we used to talk about zombies, remember? And they showed us how you could aim energy at a whole collection of compromised systems. Those compromised systems would then aim the collective energy at an endpoint. That endpoint would be overwhelmed. And it didn't do you much good to put protection at the front door of that overwhelmed endpoint. Do the physics, right? You're going to overwhelm the security device. So we turned our attention at the ballroom, the center that we were doing for the White House, and I freaked out. Realized that if we were DDoSed for a day, we'd miss the millennium change, right? So we consulted every security expert we could find around the globe and came to the conclusion that there was no solution. We actually went and spun up President Clinton about this. So our solution actually was to hover around consoles, and we were going to just toggle power if we were DDoS. This was circa 1999. After that, I was a little nervous because we went and looked in the AT&T network, found zombies all over the place, and came to the conclusion that we'd better start protecting ourselves. So I started throwing data collection systems all over the place to see if zombie attacks aimed at AT&T could potentially have some effect. And we got pretty good at collecting data. A few years later, once we started to see the era of the worm emerge, I was in the lobby of the Marriott over in San Antonio. Was down visiting the Information Warfare Center. Before breakfast, one of our engineers grabs me and says, Ed, I want to show you something. This was January 3rd or 4th of 2003. He shows me on this very specific UDP port. That's one of the protocols of the Internet. Some weird activity on UDP 1433 and 1434. It was a Microsoft SQL port. Oh, what's that? And I go, I don't know. It looks unprecedented spikes, and for about 3 weeks we watched these crazy spikes. Didn't know what the heck we were looking at. Turned out it was the slammer worm being attempted for a month, and then boom, the slammer worm hit, and we went, whoa. We've been watching this for about a month. Again, we didn't know we were watching, but it got us very excited. So what did I do? Throw more collectors and more energy, and we started getting to the point where we could pick up the rhythm of a worm. Unfortunately, the threat kind of has shifted, right? It's shifted to something we now refer to as a botnet. And back during that worm era, it was particularly disconcerting that we didn't have a good solution for businesses or consumers. Now, there's a good friend of mine, a lot of you may know, Marcus Raynham, built the first firewall at the White House. He has a quote that I think is worth repeating. He said, the tragedy of modern computing is that we've turned every man, woman, and child into a Windows system administrator. And if you think about that, that really is true. I mean, we talk a lot about a free and open internet. Go talk to your mom and dad or your neighbors about whether they think their computer is their friend or foe most of the time. When your computer's going like this, and it's kind of acting very slowly, you've got malware running on that thing, and the malware walks right by your security software, and in many cases eats up a lot of the outbound bandwidth. That is an unacceptable situation, and there's a lot of economists in the room here. I don't know whether you've ever sat down and created some model that maybe, calculates the collective impact on our productivity as a nation in dealing with these patching and other types of things that Verizon and Comcast, AT&T, every business around the world has to contend with. This became very obvious to us during this worm era as we watch endpoints spilling garbage onto networks with SLAs that said 3 things. Push the packets, don't drop any, and don't slow them down. And oh, by the way, don't peek at any of this stuff either. So we'd sit and watch, and I know our neighbors at Verizon and Comcast are doing the same thing. We sit and watch these doozies of an attack and really not do anything about it, because in some sense our SLA would preclude us from doing anything, and if we're in a peering arrangement, might not even be our customer. Now, that's an unacceptable situation, and now, in this era of botnets, it's even more intense. I just testified at the Senator Rockefeller's Commerce Committee, and I told the committee that we've got a very big problem. If you ask me right now to go pick 2 or 3 folks from my team and basically cause a global disruption, I could do it. I could probably do it before lunch, and I know there's a lot of people who could do it as well. The way you do it is with a botnet. Botnets are astoundingly easy to code. I've been a professor in the computer science department at the Stevens Institute of Technology for 20 years, and coding a botnet is like a second problem in a midterm for undergraduates. I mean, it's amazingly easy. We watch thousands of them all day long, recruiting PCs that are not properly protected or even properly protected. We watch them attacking endpoints, and it's not entirely clear what to do. Let me do some math with you. If you have about, a meg upstream from your PC on your DSL connection, if you've got FiOS, you got 20 times that. And I write a malware, a little bot piece of software that sits on your PC and steals about 500 kilobits per second, then I only need 3 PCs to take out a T1, right? 3 times 500 kilobits. Well, most of the botnets that we look at are about 10, 15, 20, 30,000 strong, in some cases even larger. 16,000 is enough to take out an OC192. 64,000 will take out a 40 gig pipe. And what do we see with Conficker or Storm? These are several million strong. We don't know who owns them. We don't know who controls them. Somebody somewhere can push a button, and all of these bots would start spewing garbage around the internet. Some of you might have seen the 60 Minutes piece where Mike McConnell was asked, could this sort of thing happen? The answer is yes. I think it's time that we do the physics, folks. Endpoints cannot stop these problems. The only way you can stop them is upstream in the cloud. And the problem that we have, it was alluded to earlier, is that where for the last 25 years we've gone off and done these things, trying desperately to be proactive to protect infrastructure, now I have a group of lawyers, some of them with body language like a lot of you have right now, sort of glaring at us, saying, how dare you? And I want to sit back and say, how dare we what? We're desperately trying to protect infrastructure. We're not doing something here, for some nefarious or even financial purpose. This is to protect essential services that we rely on, and furthermore, to protect the experience that consumers have on the internet. I've told you that we could knock that out tomorrow, we being some malicious source. So a large part of this debate around congestion, around how network operators can or can't manage their systems, has got to include the security component. And sadly, I think most of the debate that I've seen in that regard has completely missed the point. So happy during the Q&A to entertain any suggestions or comments or questions you might have. But that's the story from the security front. Thanks.
Well then, that was kind of scary. I do need to talk to you about the real thing, though, because I do have that occur on occasion. Okay, Rob Curtis, he's deployment director at the FCC Broadband Initiative.
Thanks, George. I don't know how to follow that. Thanks very much for having me. It's always a pleasure to come and talk where George is, because I never know what kind of things he's going to say about me. So the question, I think, was, does congestion matter? I think the answer is probably unambiguously yes. What I think's interesting that I haven't seen discussed a lot is how much does it matter? And I think what I'm going to do is just share a couple of random thoughts about things that would be helpful as me and my team think about the cost of building out broadband, to get some points of view on how much congestion matters, let me lay out two different kinds of problems. Let me first say, I think there's perhaps a bit of a false dichotomy between congestion and management on the two different sides of the equation. I'll come back to that at the very end. But there are two pieces to any thinking about how much something matters or how much it costs or how much it's worth. On the one hand, there's kind of fundamentally how much does it cost? What would it cost to fix it? The other side of the question is how much is it worth? What would somebody pay to avoid having it? And I have yet to see a really robust conversation around those two pieces. And in some cases, there's really good reasons why there haven't been conversations like that. But I think if a group like this spent a lot of time thinking about it, perhaps they could start to shed some real light on it. First question, of course, is how much does congestion really cost? Right? We hear we can solve congestion with a lot of capacity. Well, how much capacity does it take and where if you avoid different kinds of traffic management techniques? What's the trade-off? For managing X set of packets in X way, how many pieces of fiber or DWDM systems really need to be deployed? Some people have that data. I haven't seen the data. It would be interesting to understand what that trade-off looks like. We're trying, with a number of engineers on my team, to do our best to model that sort of behavior. One of the interesting things we found, though, is in talking to, numbers of experts on the topic, there isn't a really well-defined way of thinking about congestion in the data network, at least not post-hoc or pre-hoc as there is in voice. In the voice world, you've got a very well-defined equation. You've got a Poisson equation that defines, for any given load, how much capacity you need, and that's largely because voice is a two-dimensional problem, right? It's duration and frequency. Data injects a very complicated third dimension, which is really kind of volume. And as far as we can tell, there isn't a really well-defined way of projecting how much capacity you need given any particular end-user behavior. You may know how often they're going to be on the internet. You may know what kind of and how frequently they're going to be on the internet. You really don't understand how bursty their traffic is going to be in any given session. When you throw a number of people together, it gets very difficult to predict at any set of point in the network exactly what you need to manage that traffic level. And that's actually, I think, part of the contributors to why we're not getting a robust conversation on the cost piece. This is really quite difficult to predict. It seems like, from what we understand, that people manage on an ad hoc basis. It's largely the case, as far as we can tell, that because growth in the traffic is going so rapidly, 30 to 40% CAGR, it's cost effective to buy a lot of capacity up front, monitor it, measure it, watch it, see how it's evolving, and just constantly stay ahead of the curve. That's a little different than the way a voice network typically got built. So I think it's, on the cost side, it's not impossible. There's data out there. But it would be interesting to get a point of view, and it's really a sensitivity, for any kind of different SLA level of congestion that people wanted to offer, what would be the incremental cost in providing that service level? Same sort of question when you think about, arises when you think about going from a best efforts network to a network that requires management or SLAs. What would be the cost of going from a 5 megabit best efforts network to a 5 megabit guaranteed service network? Unless you've got a well-defined equation or a well-defined way of thinking about that, I think that's hard to quantify. And I'll just throw my hat out. We'd love help quantifying it from people who have done it. If it turns out to be easier than I think it is, love to hear about it. The second problem, when you think about how much congestion is worth, when you think about how much it matters, is really how much is it worth. Right? We've talked about the cost side. But now you need to think about how much would someone pay for an application or an experience that was incrementally less congested. Now, as George told me months ago, it's actually quite hard thinking about discrete pieces of the economy that drive growth. Just thinking about how much broadband contributes to the overall ecosystem is hard enough. What gets really challenging is when you start thinking about sub-applications in the broadband ecosystem and how changing discretely the levels of congestion that users experience on a particular application. How valuable is that? And without getting that piece, it's quite hard, even if we got the cost piece, to weigh those two together and understand what it is that we're paying for and if it's really worth it. That, again, perhaps, is something that people who spend a lot of time investing billions of dollars in networks have given more thought to than I've been able to over the last 6 months. And it would be quite interesting to get a point of view on exactly where in the network, where in the customer experience, does each little increment of reduced congestion matter, and by how much. And again, I think it's actually a challenging problem. So it's not as though, I suspect lots of people are sitting on the data, but again, it would be quite interesting from our point of view to hear. I guess the last point that I'll come to is the thing I opened with. It's typically viewed as a pitched battle between congestion and traffic management. But it seems to me that over time, there's a third path which ameliorates some of this, and there are techniques that are going to be used in all likelihood to manage traffic in a non-traditional traffic management sort of way. And I mean two things fundamentally. One is content is increasingly going to get pushed to the edge of the network. You can see that going on with cache and store, cache servers now to avoid a lot of the spend that would be needed to haul content from India to the extent that's where it's being generated over the United States. That stuff is going to increasingly get cached locally, and to that extent, the last mile probably becomes more important in the total capacity and congestion equation. The last thing is, we're going to continue to get developments in soft developments like compression that probably significantly reduce the incremental amount of capacity required to support an incremental unit of traffic as we go forward. But I guess at the end of the day, let's not be sanguine about it. Traffic looks to be growing at 30 to 40% a year with no end in sight, and it clearly is important that traffic avoids unacceptable levels of congestion. What I think would be really interesting is to get some real focus on exactly what the puts and the takes on an acceptable level of congestion is, what it takes to solve the problem, and what it's really worth. Thanks.
Thank you, Rob. I think you've been thinking about this problem a little bit. Those are very good questions. Before I start asking questions, I guess since Rob asked quite a few, and I think some of our panelists could probably provide some answers, is there any particular part of that discussion that one of you would like to respond to? Is there? Sure, Mark, you want to use this?
Yeah, well, first of all, we'd be very willing to do whatever we can to help get to the bottom of some of the data that you're looking for to make that modeling exercise work for us, for all of us collectively. On the cost of I'm particularly intrigued by a potential answer on the idea of identifying the worth of a reliable application. I don't know that this would be an infallible approach, but it seems like, the final judge and jury on this is going to be the consumer. And we know how to do market studies. I don't know whether we can get to the answer anecdotally, but certainly that's one opportunity to try and home in on what that might be worth.
Maybe if I could respond, you had one question about what the cost difference would be between a service that was, say, at best efforts, 5 megabit per second service, and one that had a guaranteed rate at the same level. And I think the answer is substantially more expensive, and that's equivalent to a lot of the business services that a lot of ISPs offer, and they're substantially above the kind of rates that subscribers, consumers have proven interested to pay. And I think the issue that we have today is probably less thinking of ways to add guarantees to increase the cost, but how do you make it even more affordable so that more people can subscribe?
Okay, the title of the session was "Does Congestion Matter?" And I think this is something that Rob brought up, and I think, Mark, you mentioned it briefly there. Why does congestion matter? What is when the network becomes congested, either in a systematic way or in a focused overload or whatever, what is the consequence that has people like you solving these problems? I mean, what is the trigger there?
Maybe I'll take the first stab. I think, the answer is that certain applications just don't work. And that over time, if it's a persistent enough problem, people decide not to adopt and use those applications. The best example are real-time applications like a voice-over IP call or like a Skype video conferencing sort of a call. When congestion occurs, you'll see the quality in a video conference get very poor and drop out. In a VoIP call, it gets choppy, you can't hear the other person, and eventually the call is disconnected. And if that's pervasive enough across enough networks, people decide, I don't want to use that new application. I'm not interested in, using the network, or the quality is just not very good. And so it's important, particularly for those latency-sensitive applications, to make sure that there's not congestion to the best extent that you can.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I mean, it is the user experience. The user in some cases might be a consumer who's trying to stream a video from the internet, or it could be a hospital who's trying to get telemedicine information from a EMT somewhere out in the boondocks. I mean, but the fact of the matter is, if the applications don't work, if the user experience isn't satisfactory, the vehicle for those applications falls into disuse, and obviously that isn't the desirable outcome here.
Great. Jason mentioned earlier that Comcast's new congestion management effort was application neutral. I have a question for all of you, and for Ed in particular, although I'm almost scared to get the answer. The security stuff is pretty scary. Is application neutrality really a desirable component of a regulatory rule or whatever on network neutrality? If you had a choice without any anti-competitive motivation, just purely as an engineer, would application neutrality be desirable? I'll start with Ed.
Well, let's see, my 9-year-old has an iPhone. One of the advantages of having a dad who works at AT&T. And she sits on her bed and plays with these little apps, most of which are kind of dopey, but they're really not something that you would necessarily consider part of, say, the national critical infrastructure. Some little app where you paint like little skirts on dolls and things. If that doesn't work, it's not a big deal. But there are services where it would be a big deal if they're not working, right? Like, one thing I asked my team recently was whether Twitter is considered part of the critical infrastructure. And it was met with great laughter until you really stopped to think about it and thought, wait a minute, in certain parts of the globe, people were tweeting, to kind of call out certain types of abuses, and there was no other way to get that information out. And we stopped and thought for a minute and thought, you know what? Hard to believe it, but something called Twitter, where you tweet, is maybe part of the critical infrastructure. And I think there's a whole social discussion around what we would consider essential services, what we would consider non-essential services, and it's hard to imagine a society, forget about carriers, I'm just talking about society, we're the same society as you guys, we're just people like you are with families and kids and so on. It's hard to imagine one that didn't stop and think through, from a congestion, from a provision perspective, what's essential and what's not. And again, when you take a very monolithic view, then we end up sort of throwing our hands up, and my daughter's little app where she's painting skirts on dolls gets the same attention as VoIP. So it really does need to be thought through carefully. I think it's a big mistake for us not to include that as part of the debate.
Yes.
I would say two things. One, I think ultimately application-targeted congestion management systems are an exercise in some level of futility, because the network can't innovate as fast as the application developers at the edge can. So as soon as they realize that you're going after a certain protocol or application, they'll obfuscate that traffic and move it to the same port as web traffic, or they'll encrypt it, which creates lots of other problems for network operators and governments. And so I think it's just a more sustainable model to not target particular applications. The other thing, though, I would say is there's always been and always should be a significant carve-out for security and other related critical problems. So, for example, if somebody in our network is generating a lot of spam, we absolutely will go after TCP port 25 and stop that SMTP transaction. If people increasingly in the area of bots are botted, we're going to have to get more aggressive there too. So, in the areas of security and where people are, really causing problems for malicious reasons, there still has to be an ability to go after those things. But otherwise, it's tough to race against the app developers.
So, Mark, do you have anything to add to that? No? Okay. Some of you actually spoke about investing your way out of congestion. I mean, if you were to build a network that could eliminate the vast majority, say, of the management that you have to engage in, do you have any idea of the cost differential on that? What parts of the network are we really focused on resolving that problem? Is it a 10 times problem? Is it a 2 times problem? What would the bill of a local consumer look like if you were to eliminate half your congestion management efforts?
I'll take an early shot on this because I guess I brought it up first. It's conceivable, I suppose, and in fact, up until not too long ago, there was a fairly sizable student body, I guess, that agreed that, or thought that we could avoid management in a backbone by just over-provisioning. And, in the end, many of us didn't subscribe to that, and I think, it's proven out that standards like MPLS-TE and other things that account for, traffic engineering and recovery and load management really are valuable and really are needed in the backbone and are used today. But the case where I don't think anybody can come up with a way to completely avoid congestion management is in the access technology area. I mean, you have a one-on-one relationship at that point between the network and a customer, and to over-provision that for every possible use of that access facility or failure scenario would just seem, maybe I'm being too quick on this, but it seems inconceivable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It seems incompatible with, the way that we think the internet works today. You'd have to impose a set of controls on the kinds of things that endpoints could do, which are really incompatible with the way people think about using the internet today, and the way that, it's going from a regulatory perspective. And I think, human behavior is just too unpredictable. And that's the main issue. You don't know when the next big news event is going to be and where people are going to be when that happens and what they'll want to do to share information about it. You can't design for that in networks.
Yeah, it's also not static. Mark, you remember in the 80s in TDM routing, when we would, at AT&T we were calling it Fast Star, but the idea was we thought we'd kind of dealt with the congestion problem by, remember, instead of routing New York to Boston, you'd route New York to Chicago to Boston, and we thought that those TDM algorithms, in some sense, solved what we were calling congestion control then. So even if we could wave some magic wand, I mean, things change, infrastructure shifts. The algorithms that work today are not going to work tomorrow. The technology will be different tomorrow, and we would have predicted all the types of content that we see on these mobile networks now back when we were running 1G networks. You would never have imagined that sort of thing. So I don't think you should think in the context of some static, can we go push some button or do something to deal with congestion? This is why we get paid to go to work every day. I mean, it's all about congestion and control and management and so on. That's what we do. And, if that ever stopped, we'd probably, be looking for employment elsewhere. That is the essence of being a provider.
Okay, I'm sorry, Mark.
One last thought on this. There are some physics limits to this as well. I mean, the wireless case is an excellent example. I mean, I don't know what else we would put on the airwaves if we decided to build a completely congestion-free wireless network.
Mm-hmm. Right. We're talking about congestion. I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll go to the audience because I know they'll have some questions. We're talking about congestion here, but obviously you guys probably manage your network for other types of problems. What other issues could arise in a world where you guys are being told how to manage your network? I mean, what other failures or defects in the network are going to possibly occur, or reduction in service quality, not related necessarily to congestion, but to some other feature of internet service? jitter or things of that nature.
Well, there are other dimensions to, network issues, I guess would be one way to look at it. I mean, complete outage is the obvious one, but, jitter, latency, those kinds of things, and it depends on the customer set. I mean, the difference between a business requirement and a consumer requirement are probably going to converge as consumers become more sophisticated, want more out of the applications that they're being served. But, we are constantly looking at network engineering for major business customers where, milliseconds are absolutely critical. In the financial industry, for one, where, a failure on one route and a shift to a different optical path, worldwide is, a critical business impact for them.
I'll offer one. I mean, obviously, security is an issue. I don't have to go any further into the problem. But let's talk about spam for a minute, the problem that it causes. When you go out to your mailbox at home, I don't mean your email box, but your real mailbox, and sometimes you meet the mail carrier comes at my house, they pull a little truck up. Usually, it's a stack of stuff. And I know that mail carrier took a lot of time to get it perfect, right? It's a stack of magazines that my wife gets, all catalogs, all this stuff. And you know something? 95% of that goes right into the recycle bin for every one of you. And it makes me feel very sorry for that letter carrier because they went to such trouble to get it perfect, and they take it. And I might as well put a recycle bin right out by the mailbox and just say, look, thanks for all the effort, but you might as well just dump 90-something% of that. Now, turns out there's a natural limiting factor there called postal cost, right? So somebody's betting that they're going to spend the money to mail all that crap out, and some percentage will actually want it. In the world we live in, those economics don't apply because it's free, essentially, to send out spam. So we deal with so much garbage. I know the rule base that I have in our backbone right now, I'm almost afraid to tell you how many addresses, have been flagged as potential spammers. It's about 500 billion. That's how many IP addresses, we say look like they're spamming. It's because it's free. So, I mean, I know you guys do the same thing. We're just in there plucking off all this garbage. Maybe you don't know that, but that's what we do. And that's before, the stuff that hits your inbox that you might call, junk mail or spam. So it gives you some idea of how crazy people are just shoveling garbage and flipping it onto the network because it's completely free. And we're like the postal carriers, right? We got SLAs around it, we make sure we deliver it, and then boom, what do? You go, what is this spam? Delete, 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 to all this stuff that has gotten through the 500 billion source IP address filter that we already have in place. So it gives you an idea of the kinds of things that a network carrier needs to deal with, kind of related to congestion.
Okay, we have questions from the field here.
Thank you, George. Kent Nakamura from Sprint Nextel. So maybe it's a question that you can answer, George, which is why not use the price mechanism to solve some of these problems, like metered pricing for internet usage, peak usage pricing for those who clog up the network at peak periods?
Well, I always approve the price mechanism, but I suspect there's some problems with that you guys might know. What is there some way that you can identify the sources of congestion, monitor, meter it in some way that you could then bill in a real-time sense or on a monthly bill?
Let me just offer a quick one. By the way, I meant 500 billion. I said 500 billion. I was really on a roll. So, identifying sources on the internet is very difficult. Astoundingly difficult in the security area. And, I'll just leave you with a thought here. When we're tracking malicious sources, we start with the presumption that we're never really going to get to the originating source, that we can just get as close as we can. So that's an important thought to keep in mind as you deal with this problem of identifying identity or source on the internet.
Yeah, I would just say, in terms of, contribution to congestion and tying cost to that, it's tough. I don't think it's technically possible today. I know there's a guy at BT named Bob Briscoe who's done a lot of technical and economic research there, and he's brought some of that work to the IETF to see if they can build some of that into protocols. Doing that end-to-end congestion, contribution notification and accounting, I think, is very, very difficult to impossible, and we'll see. I mean, there's still folks working on, if that's possible. I'm not sure it is. I think there might be more innovation from a pricing model standpoint in the nearer term, as folks look at, other than flat rate types of services.
What do you think? I mean, this is one thing that has come up in the debates, and certainly from an economic standpoint, that congestion is something that occurs in a temporal sense. It's not that you download 10 gigs a month, it's that you try to do that in a very short period of time on Friday afternoon when all the kids get home from school and start on the internet. Is it, from a cost perspective, is it the volume that people are doing that's important, or is it the volume really in an increment that people are doing? For the pricing system to solve, you've got to reduce the demand for the congestion-causing behavior, not just reduce the demand for internet use generally. I mean, is it possible to find some way to solve that problem?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, actually, you'd be the first call as to who I would probably talk to about that. But, I mean, we do it with electricity, right? I mean, you got off-peak pricing. I think that's what you're trying to get. Is there such a thing as off-peak bandwidth usage? And yes, I think conceivably, absolutely.
Yeah.
I have an analogy. Any of you ever check into a hotel that provides Wi-Fi, and you know that between 8 and 11 p.m. you can't get anything done because everybody in the hotel is trying to do the same thing? How would you feel if your hotel said, well, you pay a little extra, we'll give you priority Wi-Fi service? And maybe you got something really important versus, again, my daughter playing some silly app or my son watching a Yankee game, that he could probably watch on TV, but it's just cooler to watch it over Wi-Fi. There's the question in a nutshell. To tell that hotel, you cannot do that, in some sense degrades the services that they could offer to their guests. But we've all had that experience. I just had it in St. Louis. I could barely send an email and had to wait till midnight, and then all of a sudden I could do anything I wanted. So it's a good analogy, I think.
Well, that's would suggest perhaps a continued flat rate pricing regime, but with some sort of, I guess, like you, Jason, you mentioned, with a business connection versus a residential connection, where the residential connection may experience difficulties that a business connection might not, even during the same.
Yeah, there are always different, SLA, expectations that come with paying more. And I think one of the challenges in the current environment with, this really preceded the NPRM, but in general, I think that it has to be the kind of market where there can be experimentation with price models and discussions about, different ways to experiment with these things. Because I think right now we're unfortunately in an environment where sometimes these things get brought up and people, completely freak out, and you can't have the conversation. And I think it's important for economists and technologists to be able to talk about, alternative models and, how we might evolve into the future of the internet, and not have to worry about that causing a problem just for bringing up the discussion, for having the discussion.
Okay, guys, I really appreciate you coming. It was an excellent presentation, excellent conversations.